show you how to make cinnamon rolls. And this recipe is actually a faster recipe than most because it has a lot more yeast. In the recipe that I provided, you may see what appears to be some strange amounts. For example, the water is 1 cup plus 3 tablespoons. I actually had to cut this recipe into thirds because when I made it for the first time in my stand mixer, it was so much that it was coming out of the top. So I have adjusted the recipe from making 24 cinnamon rolls to making 8 cinnamon rolls. The original recipe called for using 2 tablespoons of active dry yeast, but because I have instant on hand, I just reduced the amount of yeast by 25%. So I'm going to be using 1 tablespoon plus 1.5 teaspoons of instant yeast. This recipe calls for a stand mixer, and it's a lot easier to make if you have one. But if you don't, you can still make it. Just use your hands in a bowl and dump it out onto your counter and knead it, and you'll be fine. It will just take a little bit longer. Okay, so to begin, I have already started my oven preheating to 400 degrees. Again, normally you wouldn't do that this early in the stages of a yeast bread, but since we're going to get it in the oven pretty quickly, you can go ahead and start it now. This is another straight dough mixing method, so we're going to dump all of our ingredients into the mixer and mix it together as one until it becomes a nice smooth dough. This dough can be very sticky, so make sure that you continue to knead it until it is not too sticky. So I'm going to put in my water, 1/4 cup of granulated sugar, 3 tablespoons of oil, and a canola oil or a vegetable oil work fine here. My yeast, my salt, which is necessary in all yeast breads to make sure that number one, it controls the growth of the yeast. And then secondly, if you ever have bread without salt, you can feel that it tastes a little flat. And then I'm going to add in 1 egg that I've scrambled. And then finally, my 3 3/4 cups of flour. Now, as a side note, please make sure when you're adding your water that it is warm to the touch, but not boiling. And you can see in my stand mixer, I'm using my dough hook. This is only for use when you're mixing up yeast breads. It's not for use when you're mixing up, say, a cookie dough. You could also just start with the paddle and then switch over to the dough hook when you're ready to knead. Or if you don't have a dough hook at all, just keep working with the paddle. You can see that my dough has all come together, but I still need to continue to knead it in order to get that nice smooth dough. The recipe recommends 10 minutes. When you are kneading with your stand mixer, the manufacturer recommends that you have it on the slowest speed. You could possibly go up to the next speed, but definitely don't go any higher than that. I have mixed my dough in the stand mixer for about 8 minutes, and it's a nice, soft, smooth dough. So now you want to let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes in a warm spot. You can keep it in the bowl that it's in. I just took it out so that you could see. Hopefully it will rise a little bit. This is also important to let the gluten relax before we start to roll out our dough. A good place is to put it near the oven that you've had preheating. I also recommend covering it with plastic wrap just to ensure it doesn't dry out. While your dough is resting, it's a great time to make your filling, which consists of white sugar, brown sugar, cinnamon, and butter. The recipe suggests that after you've rolled out your dough, that you put about half of the butter on and then sprinkle on the sugars and cinnamon, and then after that pour the rest of the butter on. I find it's just as easy to combine everything with the butter and then spread it on like a paste. And there we go. We'll set it aside for a few minutes while we wait for our dough to finish resting. My dough is done resting, and now it's time to roll it out. Or actually, you don't even need a rolling pin. You can just use your hands to press it out into a large rectangle. A lot of times when making yeast bread, they recommend throwing some flour down, but this is a really nice dough. We don't have to do that. I recommend putting a little bit of oil down on your counter instead. And again, that's just some of the vegetable or canola oil that you used before. Okay, and just press it out into a large rectangle. You want to have even thickness throughout. If you prefer to roll it, you definitely could if you wanted. I know a lot of times it's easier if you have an exact measurement, so I'll look to see what mine is. It's about 18 inches by 12. Now that we have it rolled out, we are going to put our butter and sugar and cinnamon mixture on. And what you want to do is leave the top part up here empty. So that way when you roll it and you're sealing it, it will make for an easier seal. You can use a rubber spatula if you'd like, or just press it out with your hands. Whatever works best for you. You could even use the back of a spoon to do it. I happen to have an offset spatula, so that's what I'm going to use to spread it around. And as you do it, if you find that it's grabbing too much dough, go ahead and just switch to your hands. Make sure that you get edge to edge, because if you're one of the people who gets the end cinnamon roll, you want to make sure that there's enough filling in there for you. If you like a lot of filling, go ahead and double the recipe for the filling. It'll taste great. Now that you have your dough covered, you're going to start from the long edge closest to you and roll up tightly. When you get to the edge, I like to bring it over and then pinch it along the seam so that way it doesn't come apart when baking. At this point, after you've rolled it, a lot of times it starts to spread out and you end up with very high, narrow rolls when you cut it into 8. So if yours have done that, just go ahead and squish it in a little bit to make a little bit of a fatter roll. And that way, when you cut them into 8, they'll be wider in your pan instead of really high and narrow. So now I am going to slice my cinnamon rolls into 8. Yes, you could use a knife to do this, but the best way to get perfectly round cinnamon rolls is to actually use something that you probably have in your household, dental floss. Now, if you have mint flavored, you probably don't want to use that, but this is just plain dental floss. And before you use this, I think that the best thing to do is on your cinnamon roll log here, you're going to want to mark 8 even pieces. It makes it a lot easier when you start to use your dental floss. So using any sort of knife or whatever, first make a mark at the halfway, make a mark in the halfway point of there, and the halfway point of the other side, and then halfway again, so that you've separated it out into 8 even pieces. Now you can take your dental floss and slide it underneath the edge of the roll, and right where you have made your mark, just pull the strands together and pull them apart. And you can see it makes a beautifully round cinnamon roll. So continue doing that with the rest of them, and then we are going to place them in a pan for baking. Transfer your cinnamon rolls to a baking pan. You can use a 9x13 casserole dish, you can use just a plain baking sheet, whatever you want, but be sure to either put down some parchment or spray the pan to ensure that it doesn't stick. I'm going to put these in the oven for 12 to 15 minutes, and during that time, it's a great time to make your icing. With icing recipes, you can either do a cream cheese frosting. You can do one that I'm going to show you that's very simple with just powdered sugar and water or milk, or you can even use orange juice to give it a different flair. Okay, and these are ready to go in the oven. To make this frosting, all you need is a cup of confectioner's sugar, some tablespoons of milk, half and half, whatever you have, and then some flavoring. I like to use vanilla or maple is really my favorite, but really you could do anything. Coconut, you can even add a little bit of cinnamon in here, whatever floats your boat. And just mix it together until you get a frosting consistency. You may find that it's a little thick and you have to add a bit more liquid. But don't thin it out too much, because once you put it on your hot cinnamon rolls, it's going to melt into them. So you don't want it to be so runny that it runs right off of them. My icing is complete, and now I just have to wait until my cinnamon rolls come out. I recently saw a tip that when your cinnamon rolls come out, put half of the frosting on immediately so that it helps melt into them and leave the dough really soft. And then after they've cooled, put on the rest of the frosting so that you can have that thicker, crusty frosting on top. I've had my cinnamon rolls in the oven for 15 minutes. When I took them out, they were starting to brown on top, but they still looked a little underdone on the sides. So I covered the pan with foil and put it back in the oven. That way it can continue to cook without browning on the top. My cinnamon rolls came out, and I'm going to lather them with the icing.